Hello, I'm Josh Hale, and welcome to Week 2, our first week of reading in the Mere Christianity book study group. This week, we're taking a look at Book 1 of Mere Christianity, called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And there's little mention of Christianity in this book. Did you notice that? This first section of reading, we didn't really get into Christianity that much. Instead, Lewis is going to build a foundation of his apologetic by making a rational argument. In other words, he doesn't presume that the reader already believes Orthodox Christianity. So what is an apologetic? Well, the formal definition of apologetic is the nature of a formal defense or justification of something, such as a theory or a religious doctrine. In layman's terms, and for our purposes, apologetics is the study and the practice of the defense of the Christian faith. Now, the first thing that Lewis talks about is the law of human nature. So what is the law of human nature? Well, here in chapter 1, Lewis offers the nature of quarreling as evidence for this law of human nature, and it'll all make sense as he explains this. It's also referred to as the moral law, and that might be familiar to some of you. This law tells us how that we as humans are to act. We know that we can take not just right action or wrong action, but that we should take right, decent, or fair action. The law of human nature is also universal. All people everywhere know this same moral law without it ever being taught to them. In other words, it's intrinsic to who we are as human beings. And whether we admit it or not, all men recognize it, and we even appeal to it. But this is biblical, and it affirms what the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, where Paul writes this: "Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that they know His law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them that they are doing right. And this is the message that I proclaim, that the day is coming when God, through Christ Jesus, will judge everyone's secret life." Lewis argues against the idea that one's culture's morality is not at all the same as another's. He does not deny the truth of cultural and historical variation in morality, but that the difference in these cultures are insignificant. There's never been a morality that does not have at its core the moral law. There are certain laws that we as humans intrinsically know are right and wrong. Human beings possess this moral law because we were made in God's image. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27 tells us, "God said, 'Let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground.'" So God created human beings in His own image. In the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. Lewis also notes that some people try to suppress this moral law, or they use it incorrectly. Again, going back to Romans, this agrees with what the Bible says regarding morality and how it is wielded by sinful men. Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23 tells us, "Yeah, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles." Lewis states that this universal inborn moral law governs humankind in the same way that laws like gravity govern the material universe. But unlike these material laws, however, people can choose whether or not that they obey the law of human nature. In fact, breaking this moral law is a defining trait of all mankind. All people do things at times that they know they shouldn't do. Likewise, they sometimes fail to do what they know they ought to do. Now, this information, the reality of the law of human nature, and our constant failure to keep it, is the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. In chapter 2, Some Objections, Lewis presents some arguments against his central point in chapter 1. Some people argue that the moral law is just an evolved herd instinct. They argue that sometimes right and wrong are at odds. For example, when we witness someone in danger, right, we'll experience both of our basic instincts. A herd instinct, which tells us that we need to fight on behalf of the person, and another instinct which tells us we need to protect ourselves and run away, right? Regardless of which instinct we experience, we know that deep down of the two, the right thing to do is to try and help that other person. This brings to mind what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 7, verses 21 through 24. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? This is a manifestation of the law of human nature, the moral law. Lewis provides an elegant analogy for the relationship between our instincts and the moral law. Our instincts are like the keys of a piano, and the moral law is the sheet music telling us which key to play and when. Now, to the objection that the moral law is learned socially, or that it comes from how you were raised, Lewis argues that the moral law is the real truth that belongs in the same class as mathematics. And we do learn rules about decent behavior from other people, but some of these rules are arbitrary social customs that might be different depending on where you live. Therefore, they're not the same thing as the moral law, which can be seen running through the morality of all cultures across the world. No more evidence for the reality of the moral law is our belief that some moralities are superior to others, right? Our preference for Christian morality over Nazi morality, for example, and our ideas about social progress point to the existence of a standard. In chapter 3, The Reality of the Law, Lewis talks about how humans do not always follow their own nature, and that this has consequences. The law of human nature tells us what man ought to do, not what he will do. Now, people often try to explain their failure to follow the moral law because, well, it's odd, right? It's not a matter of what's best for us or society, and it's not necessarily what's most convenient. This moral law must represent some different form of reality. Now, the fact that there is a moral imperative implies that there must be more than one kind of reality. Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 20 says this, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." In chapter 4, What Lies Behind the Law, Lewis discusses the two main views of the universe, the materialist view and the religious view. Now, the materialist view claims that what exists has always existed or came into existence randomly. The religious view claims that there is a mind behind the universe, a mind with a purpose, a mind with a will. Now, Lewis writes that science can't determine which of these views is right because it can't address essential questions like who, what, why. The only thing in the universe that we can know more about and that we can learn from observation is a moral law. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29 tells us, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of the law." This is also later affirmed in the New Testament in John's Gospel. Paul even talks about it in his letter to the Corinthian church. And finally, in chapter 5, We Have Cause to Be Uneasy, Lewis discusses progressivism. He points out that going forward is not always progress if you're headed in the wrong direction. To truly progress the right way, sometimes you have to turn the clock backwards. And the sooner a person corrects an error in his or her life, the faster that progress will be made. The moral law tells us God, and this is actually the first time in the book that Lewis starts addressing God directly. The moral law tells us that God is intensely interested in right conduct. It does not imply that He's good in the sense of being soft or indulgent. Only a person can forgive, Lewis tells us, right? If this God is an impersonal, absolute goodness, then it makes no sense to ask it to excuse us when we break the moral law. At the same time, this force of absolute goodness must hate most of what we do. You see, humanity finds itself in a catch-22 situation. We're doomed because of our sinfulness, unless an absolute goodness rules the universe. But if such a goodness does rule the universe, our failure to keep that moral law means we're making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day. So we're doomed if we do, and we're doomed if we don't. So what can we understand about the moral law in the world we live in? Well, we can know that the universe was made by a great artist. It was made by a designer. This being has to be a person or a personal being, because without personhood, there could be no forgiveness. The being is interested in the good, in the moral sense of the word, not in a soft, indulgent, making you feel fuzzy kind of goodness. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 through 27 tells us, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries." Lewis now brings Christianity into his argument for the first time. Christianity begins to talk, as he says, only once we realize the three things that Lewis has argued thus far: that there is a real moral law and a power behind that law, and that our continual failure to keep the law puts us at odds with that power. And it's at this point of desperation that Christianity really becomes relevant, because Christianity acknowledges and offers a remedy for humanity's horrifying existential position. Christianity is ultimately a thing of unspeakable comfort, and it begins in this place of dismay. In other words, the shadow proves the sunshine, right? It's only because we're in this bad catch-22 situation that we can really appreciate the beauty of Christianity. Lewis is firm. We cannot find the comfort we need by seeking it directly. Only our hope of finding comfort, or I should say, our only hope of finding comfort is to seek the truth. So what is our only hope and comfort then? Well, I'll close with what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 6, verses 17 through 18. Our only hope and comfort. "But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and, having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness."